So I'm looking forward to another wonderful conversation with Pastor Carel Smith and Dr. Willie McLeod looking at Revelation. And today we're going to do a bit of a review of Revelation 9. And I have to say, there's a massive amount of really interesting um, sort of key things that stand out. And every time I talk about Revelation, some of these things pop out. But before we get going, I just wanted to, how are you guys doing? How was the week, Carel? You had a bit of downtime,
Yeah,
eh?
I'm on holiday, so it's lovely. I can read and I can meditate and I can make some food and do what I like.
Yeah,
Thank
just
you.
relax and enjoy things, eh?
That is true.
Yeah, and Willie, on your side.
Yeah, I'm just busy finalizing the editing for my new book on the Nephilim. So it's quite a process, lots of work. The writing takes time, but the editing takes about half the time that's needed for the writing.
I have to say, there's quite a few of us are really looking forward to book 3. I think it's going to be absolutely amazing and very, very interesting. And there's a lot of information that I think most of it is information you can't find anywhere else. The same with book 1 and 2. But hint, hint, nudge, nudge. I really think we need to do a few podcasts covering the first and the second book. And once the third one comes out, we can do one on that as well. It's such a wonderful topic. So I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, perfect. So just kicking off with Revelation 9. I think the two names that stand out is Abaddon and Apollyon. And I think during the conversation, we'll probably touch on that as well. Other things that sort of hits me is, the star that falls from heaven, given a key to the bottomless pit, and what happens to mankind. And unfortunately, people that did not repent. So Carel, I'm going to ask you to kick us off. Yeah. So
yeah, you touched a few things there.
Yes, I did.
But the chapter starts with this star you mentioned, which fell from heaven, and which actually is an angel who was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. So if you read the chapter, you see angels are mentioned quite a few times, and you have to discern between fallen angels and angels of God. Although it even looks that both the angels of God and the fallen angels are used to for God's purposes, even to bring judgment to the earth. But yeah, maybe we can start with this first angel and just have a short look at it. The fifth angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star fallen from heaven to earth, and he was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. He opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from that shaft rose smoke like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened with the smoke from the shaft. Then from the smoke came locusts on the earth, and they were given power like the power of scorpions of the earth. So this seems to be a devastating judgment which came on earth. And this angel opened the shaft to the bottomless pit, which is actually you can say, the habitation of the demons. But if you look closer, it seems that you have to discern between what is really happening on earth and what is just a reference to the powers in the heavens. Maybe Willie can help us to think more intense what these locusts are that actually came to earth. Is it spirit beings that will attack the people, or is it mere symbols pointing to maybe an army? If you look at the book of Joel, which also spoke of the locusts but that was actually the Babylonian army which was intended there. Yeah, so maybe, Willie, you can touch on that and tell us, should we take this locusts in a literal understanding, or do you think it's merely symbolic?
Yeah, so I think this is chapter 9 in the book of Revelation is surely one of the most dramatic chapters in the Bible. This is really dramatic. We know this angel receiving the key to open this bottomless pit, and like smoke from a furnace, the smoke rising out of the pit and the locusts coming forth. And it's quite a dramatic description also of these locusts. They are described as you've already read, being quite similar to scorpions, and also similar to lions, having teeth of lions, like that of lions, and later on heads of lions, and like horses, they like horses. So there's quite a lot of very strange similarities that's being described here with different kind of animals. But I think what is important is that the word, it's used about 12 times just in this one chapter. So I think one should take that into account, that the prophet is describing something in terms of these symbols, but I don't think we should take it literally as scorpions or something. This is definitely not the case. And the fact that 12 times he's just describing something that's like locusts having breastplates of iron, making this enormous noises like chariots being pulled in by horses in war, the sound of chariots, this massive thundering sound that is described. So this whole description, I think, is quite dramatic. But I think to understand Revelation, it's very important for us to go back to the Old Testament and to various passages in the Old Testament. And we've already seen when we discussed chapter 8, the previous chapter, the first 4 trumpets, we've seen that there's a very close similarities with the book of Ezekiel, chapters 1 and 10, also 9 and 10. In this case, we find a very close correspondence with the book of Joel, as you have mentioned. In the first instance, there are these locusts. In the book of Joel, they actually describe various kinds of locusts according to their phase of metamorphosis. So there are different kinds that's described, and I get the impression that maybe in Revelation we have something similar, because the ones described in the first part of the chapter and the ones described in the second part of the chapter seems to be slightly different from each other. So we have this description of locusts, and we have also what is shared in Revelation and in the book of Joel is they described as armies. So described as an army. In Joel, we find 3 times reference to God's army or the army in some way, but the word army is used 3 times. It's also used in this chapter.
I can just sort of read. If you look at Joel 2 verse 2, it says, "A day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness, like dawn spreading across the mountains. A large and mighty army comes, such as never was in ancient times, nor will ever be in ages to come."
Absolutely. Yeah. So
quite a frightening scene.
So they locusts, they described as an army. In the book of Joel, one is not quite sure, is it the locusts that is described as an army, or is it this army that's described as locusts?
Yes.
But eventually I would go for it's actually the army, because he's describing how the army comes from the north and attacking, and so on. So we know that historically this is what happened. So I think that description is the army coming from the north and described in terms of locusts. What is also a shared description is having teeth like lions. We find that in Joel chapter 1. So we find that. I can see if I can find it, then I can read it to you guys. So they have teeth like locusts, like lions, and then they. Let me just find
I can actually read that. They said the locusts look like horses prepared for battle. On their heads they wore something like crowns of gold, and their faces
Yeah, but in
resembled
Joel.
Yeah. Oh, you're looking at Joel.
I'm referring to Joel. Yeah,
Okay.
so in Joel chapter 1, verse 6, it says, a nation has come up against my land, strong and without number. His teeth are the teeth of a lion. So here we find this, and then we find exactly the same expression also in Revelation chapter 9.
Yeah.
So this is a shared description.
Mm.
So both passages describe an army looking, or in some way looking like locusts, or described as locusts, as a massive swarm of locusts. The darkening of the skies and the sun and moon is described in both passages. These locusts being like, having the teeth of lion and being like horses. Like horses is also described in both passages. And then the massive sound that is compared with that of chariots, chariots of war, driving out or riding out in battle. This both descriptions in both cases find exactly the same description. So there can be absolutely no doubt that what we find in Revelation is closely related, is building upon that which we find in the book of Joel, chapters 1 and 2.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes I've seen people, when we read the book of Revelation sort of in isolation, and we do not take this literary background into account, the fact that these passages are taken from the Old Testament, and in this case from the book of Joel, then one can come to all sorts of strange conclusions. One can see these kind of strange, these descriptions as describing some kind of strange monsters that will come upon the earth or something, but this is definitely not the case. It's not monsters. It's a shared description. It's the same symbols. So that gives us reason to think that it's actually an army that's being described in both cases. So it's actually a war, and certain, perhaps different kinds of locusts describe different kind of warfare, or kind of weapons or stuff that's used in battle also. Because as I've said, the two descriptions in the first and the second part of the chapter is slightly different.
Yeah.
And then also the intensity that in the first part, the locust just caused suffering for, I think, 5 months. And in the second part, they causes death. But if you look at the suffering they cause, the people will long to die, but death will flee from them. So
they will seek death but not find it.
The only conclusion I will make is that will be absolute severe suffering caused by these locusts.
So just a quick question there as well.
Part we do find people dying as sorry, a third of the people is killed of mankind in the second part of this chapter. So it's in the first part we have what you've just mentioned, and in the second part we do find that about it says a third of mankind is killed by these horse described as horsemen. Sorry.
So one question that I want to ask that relates to all of that. Okay, so it's very clear that they're coming. There's going to be suffering. It's 5 months. A third of men are going to die, but they say they will torture the men without the seal of God. Any comment around what the seal of God is in this situation, or any? You guys want to take a guess?
Yeah, okay. See, we have seen in the previous 2 chapters, we've discussed chapter 7 and chapter 8. In chapter 7, we've seen that God has sealed the 144,000 for the plagues that is to come, or are to come. Now, those plagues are described from chapter 8, 9, and further on. So the reference to those that do not have the seal of God on their foreheads are a reference to those that's not sealed in chapter 7. So all of those, so in this case, seemingly it refers to godless people, is then touched by these plagues. So the ones that God has sealed in a kind of protective, the seal is in a certain sense, if we compare it again with Ezekiel's description, it's not something that really happened in Ezekiel. It's just a kind of symbol how God has sort of sealed these people in the sense of showing that he protects them. And it's within this terrible war against Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar coming against Jerusalem, that Ezekiel describes this, how God will protect certain of his people, his saints, within that context. I think we have exactly the same thing referring to here in Revelation, that God will protect his people, those that love and serve the Lord. So a certain amount, he mentions 144,000. And we've discussed that. It refers to Israelites. It seems that this battle must be related to Israel, Jerusalem, and we'll come back to that in the next discussion when we do chapter 11, because in that case Jerusalem is directly mentioned, or the city of Jerusalem is mentioned. So, so definitely, this is, in my opinion, it's a war that's been described here, with these remarkable symbolism. Yeah.
Yeah, you have the same prophetic theme, as you've mentioned, Willie, in Ezekiel, where the people who were grieving over the bad situation and the godlessness, they were marked. But you can even go further back to the 10 plagues with Pharaoh, where the people of God were not touched by the plagues.
Yes,
you have
absolutely.
the same recurring theme that God protects his people, starting there in the first books of the Bible and going right through to Revelation. So the people of God do not have to be terrified by these horrible things which will come. They can trust in his protection, that he will be with them and that he will keep them and carry them through all of it.
Yeah.
And my
I
next,
agree. Absolutely.
and in Revelation 9, there's also again a reference to troops. And if you look at the New King James Version, the number of the mounted troops was twice 10,000 times 10,000.
200
horsemen.
Yeah. So that's
200
another
million.
200 million. That's incredible.
Enormous. Yeah.
So any comments on
so that's
that?
a massive army.
Yeah.
That's a massive army that we're talking about in this case. What is also important, and which I can mention, is that the different descriptions that we find in the first and the second part of this chapter. In the first case, we find that these what is described as locusts, but they also we do find that they are like their torment was like the torment of a scorpion, because we read that they have power like scorpions. And then we also have read that they have these, they were like horses prepared for battle. Their breastplates were like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots with many horses running into battle. And they had tails like scorpions, and there were stings in their tails. Now, so if one take the fact that the scorpion, the locusts, is actually flying. It's wings that's described here. The sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots with many horses running into battle. So this enormously loud and terrible sound, this thundering sound, one gets the impression that perhaps John is describing something in terms of the future, some kind of weaponry, for example, maybe warplanes or something, where we do find this kind of terrible noise, especially as far as the wings are mentioned, in which case that they had tails like scorpions and stings in their tails, it's perhaps a description of the weaponry they're carrying, these airplanes. And, because for John, it would have been totally for him impossible to have an airplane or something, but describing it in these terms by these animals that we've already discussed, locusts.
And it almost
horses.
sounds like the rotor blades of a gunship,
Yeah.
Or a helicopter or something like that.
Yeah, and then the second part, also we have a very interesting discussion. The horses, they have these, again, the breastplates, different colors of breastplates, and the heads of the horses were like the heads of lions. So in this case, they have these massive heads, and out of their mouths came fire, smoke, and brimstone. Fire, smoke, and brimstone. Now that seems very much like gunfire.
Yeah.
Or not necessarily gunfire, but artillery or any kind of fire. And by these three plagues, a third of mankind was killed by the fire and the smoke and the brimstone, which came out of their mouths. And then we read that they had their power in their mouths and in their tails. For their tails are like serpents having heads, and with them they do harm. So this second description reminds me very much of tanks, a battle tank. And these snakes with heads, it's quite clear what one would be referring to, and so it seems to me, actually, especially since the fire, smoke, and brimstone is so clearly, corresponding to what we do find in terms of firing during a war or modern warfare. So perhaps in the second case, we have a reference to tanks and so forth, whereas in the first case, we have some kind of flying machine, helicopters or warplanes or whatsoever. But this is just speculation. We shouldn't take it too serious. But I think this descriptions are, in my opinion, quite close to what we do find in modern times. But if the second coming of the Lord and these things are still somewhere in the distant future, then perhaps other things are being referred to that we do not even know about.
Yeah.
Actually, as we've been moving through the chapters, we started, I think, in chapter 6, the opening of the seals and the 4 horsemen, and one of the horsemen was actually the red horse.
Yeah,
the red horse, and that was war. But
exactly.
This was an overview. So if the next after the seals, where we are at the trumpets, and these trumpets describe a more detailed understanding of warfare and different weapons of the warfare causing different kinds of destruction. It makes a lot of sense if you look at it that way.
Yeah, so it's very speculative, but I do think
war is a major theme in Revelation. So
absolutely,
it does make sense.
So there can be no doubt in my mind that this is a description of warfare and people fighting in battle.
And even if you go back to the other prophecies in Ezekiel and Joel, both of them were also a description of warfare. In Ezekiel,
Exactly.
it was the Jerusalem, and even in Joel, it was the Babylonians, with the same kind of symbolism. So I have to say, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other, it looks like the main character is Abaddon or Apollyon. So the Bible refers to him as
Yeah.
the destroyer, and I mean he comes up a couple of times in the Bible as well. I mean, Job refers to him in Job 26 verse 6, 28 verse 22, and 31 verse 12. So any thoughts around
Yeah, I'll just give an
Yeah. So
introduction. Sorry, Willie.
go ahead, Carl.
Verse 11 in chapter 9 says, these scorpions, no, what do you call them? Grasshoppers. They have as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit. And his name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek, Apollyon. So it seems as the description of this war, sometimes you see it on the ground in the physical realm, and sometimes you see it in the spirit realm. But you cannot really separate these two completely. Even though the angel of the bottomless pit is a spirit, he somehow summons these evil powers, and they manifest just as a wall on the ground.
yeah, this is quite interesting, Carel, what you're mentioning. This kind of mirror image between what we find in heaven and what happens on earth. For example, in this next part, in the second part of the chapter, we read about these 4 angels bound at the great river Euphrates, and how they are being released, and we read that they have been prepared for the hour and the day and the month and the year, were released to kill 1/3 of mankind. So we read that the angels are prepared and then released to kill 1/3 of mankind. But the angels are not the ones that kill the people. Because just underneath, we read this, that it was by these 3 plagues that 1/3 of mankind was killed, the fire and the smoke and the brimstone that came out of their mouths. Yeah. So, in a certain sense, the angels play a certain kind of role, but these strange creatures, these locusts or what they may be, let's say tanks or whatsoever, during this terrible war, we find that 1/3 of mankind is killed. Now, although it refers to 1/3 of mankind, I'm not 100% sure whether we should necessarily take this as a worldwide event, or whether it's just 1/3 of man in the sense of all the people involved that's been killed. I'm not, I can't really form a final opinion regarding that. But it does seem like a very terrible event, with 1/3 of at least the people involved dying in this terrible battle. So here we see this mirror image between something that's described in terms of the angels and something that happens in terms of the events on earth.
But also, which is very interesting, is for the first time, a physical location on earth is mentioned. The Euphrates, which was a very important river, describing actually the borders of the original promised land of Israel. And then the army coming from there, from the north, also quite similar, which happened, and the army which was described in Joel. But this army seems to be much, much bigger.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting how this is suddenly very topical as well. So you find a lot of this in the media at the moment. So
yeah, and to come back to the Abaddon, in Hebrew Abaddon and in Greek, his name was Apollyon. Now, Abaddon meaning destruction, and Apollyon destroyer. And he's coming out of the bottomless pit. He's the king over these beings. And as king over them, we should at the same time read them not only as military equipment and stuff, but also as demonic kind of beings that's involved and that's causing this kind of terrible war to happen. So it's sort of as a meaning that lies seemingly on different levels. So he was the king. They had as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit. Now, later on in the book of Revelation, we'll find that this king, is also described in terms of, for example, as the beast. And later on in chapter 17 is described as the beast that came out of the bottomless pit. And so we'll find quite a few references. We do find quite a few references to him later on again throughout Revelation, and we'll discuss it in some detail. But he arises out of the bottomless pit at this late stage. And we do read in chapter 17 that there will be a great battle in which he will fight against Jesus Christ. But at this stage, what is interesting is the reference to destruction, the reference to destroy. So it seems that he is a kind of leader that brings destruction upon the earth. You know, he doesn't worry about the future existence of humankind, but he is a great destructor. He destroys the earth. And later on, we do find again a reference in Revelation to that. What is also interesting is in Greek terms, there was in the ancient Greek mythology, we also find that the god Apollo, agreeing with this name Apollyon, he also had a kind of version that was allocated to the lower parts of the Greek underworld, Tartarus. And in the book of, I think it's in the book of, is it 2 Peter or is it Jude, where there's actually a reference to the angels that had been bound in Tartarus. It's quite interesting that we do find that term. So it seems that this is actually the moment where this leader, and in terms of other passages, for example, in Isaiah, where we read about the king of the Rephaim, where the Rephaim also, in my view, refers to exactly these same beings. So it seems that this king of the Rephaim, this king, even one could even relate this to the Nephilim that will return, because this theme of the Rephaim returning is, I think, definitely underlying this particular passage. It's just my way of thinking, yeah.
Yeah. So, Willie, just a question as well. If you talk about Abaddon or Apollyon, do you think he is going to have a physical presence, or Carel just sort of mentioned about spiritual as well? Do you have any?
Well, I think maybe it hasn't happened yet, so it's something, in my opinion, that must still happen. And I think maybe Lord of the Rings, you know, if you look at Sauron, at first it didn't have the physical shape, but eventually it seems to take a physical shape. This is difficult. You know, we read later on in chapter 17 that the beast, he was once. So somewhere in history, he existed. But during the time of the Roman Empire, John writes, he's not at the moment.
Yeah.
But he will be in future. So we will come back to that passage in chapter 17 and discuss it in some detail. But so that is definitely a reference to the fact that he somehow has been bound with the angels in Tartarus or in the bottomless pit. And at a certain point in history, this pit will be opened and they will be set free. And this will result in terrible, terrible things happening on earth.
Yeah.
And this location mentioned, Euphrates, it is very interesting that that is a very specific place on earth, where these angels were bound. Do we have any more information on that?
I think at this stage, we do again find a reference to that in chapter 16, when we read about the great war and the bells and so on. So we'll return to that. But at this stage, the text doesn't give a lot of information, except, as you have mentioned, perhaps that the armies will come from that direction towards Jerusalem or towards Israel, attacking from that part of the world. So that's I think, quite a viable opinion. Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I just out of interest, with this focus on the Euphrates, John F. Walford wrote an article specifically about that. He calls it the Kings of the East and the Oriental Confederacy. And he says one of the significant developments of the 20th century is the political and military awakening of the Orient. The great nations of Asia east of the Euphrates River, slumbering for centuries, are now beginning to stir and become a major factor in the international situation. So quite an interesting comment there.
Yeah, so we do read about the nations of the East later on in chapter 16, but at this stage, I'm not sure. Maybe it's the Iranians attacking the Israelis,
You never know.
You never know. So, yeah. So that's the text just doesn't give us enough information.
It doesn't say the US military withdrew, and
it does give some colors of the breastplates, but I think one should be careful, because it's happened so often in the past that people tend to read the current events into scripture. So they read the Bible in terms of the events of their time, and that's, I think, one should be very, very careful. So that's why I do not really want to commit to anything in terms of our present geographical situation, geopolitical situation in the world, because maybe the world scene will change still to some extent towards the end of times. I believe these things most likely refer to the end of times because of the great battle that's described as the Battle of Armageddon, and that will take place clearly at the end with the second coming of Christ, as described also in chapter 19. But we'll come to that. We'll discuss all
but
those.
the Euphrates, which is which seems to be drying up, which was a natural boundary, if that boundary is not there anymore, it will be much easier for armies from the north to march south. So many people see that as a very important event on the prophetic time clock,
Yeah, it's interesting, but I'm very careful to take it too far. On the one hand, I'm quite a skeptical person as a scientist. So, I'm very careful that we do not commit to too much, in terms of things that we just do not know. It's future things that.
But are there not another Bible text that mentions that the Euphrates will dry up?
Yeah, it's in chapter 16. We'll come to that.
So we will come to that.
Yeah.
So I mean, if we can just sort of wrap everything up, I think the important thing is that there's a strong reference to a huge battle that's happening. We're not quite sure of these scorpions coming in, what they're going to look like, but I think the key things is a battle is coming. The king of the bottomless pit will be released. He will play a huge role. A third of mankind will die. The two other things that stand out is the fact that those that do not have the seal of God will be tortured, and even if that happens, they will still not repent, which is really frightening. Is there anything else, Carel, you think is important to mention, and I want to ask Willie as well how we should I mean, if we talk to this about fellow Christians, how should we be reading this chapter? But yeah, Carel, any other thoughts?
No, not anything new, but just the important theme of war. The whole world is trying to resist and to bring peace, but it doesn't seem to be working. That the Bible, the predictions of the Bible, cannot really be changed. And even in our day, we experience big shifts on an international level, which confirms, that war will play a big role in the end times, even in Israel and much wider. But we are encouraged that even though it will be very terrifying, the Lord He will be with us, and He will be with His own, and He will protect us.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think you gave a good summary. You gave a good summary. I just think one should understand that the description here is of terrible times that come upon the earth. And as we proceed, we will see that, this is just the beginning of the plagues, of the woes. The final woe, or the seventh trumpet, which includes the 7 bowls, will be much more terrible than what we've already discussed in this session, finding described in this chapter 8 and 9. So, but we'll come to that. But it will be terrible times upon the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, there's so much talk about peace, but if you look at the portion of our planet that's currently where there's an armed conflict, it is absolutely frightening. I mean, the countries where we experience stability is I mean, there's just a few. Even if you look like a country like Mexico, I mean, you've got drug wars going on, but then just overall, if you look at a list of conflicts, it's absolutely frightening. So I do think we're heading in a very specific direction. But yeah. Awesome. So Willie, what will we be discussing next week?
Yeah, so
Chapter 10.
Next time we'll be discussing chapter 11.
Yeah.
And the city of Jerusalem, and the also in terms of war is being described. The 2 testimony
Witnesses.
Witnesses, yes, that will testify, and so forth. So this is also a very interesting passage, and we'll be discussing it next time now.
Yeah, perfect. And for the people that follow the podcast, just want to say thank you very much for liking and sharing. I see when we post something now, the numbers just shoot up. So that's really, really nice. So please continue to like and share. If there's any questions, again, just send it through to info@thebiblegps. And we also have a link to Willie's blog. So if you want to look at some additional very intriguing, very interesting information, please go and have a look at Willie's blog post. There's also a link to his books as well, if I'm correct, Willie? The books about the Nephilim. Yeah, perfect. Great stuff. Well, thanks very much. And I'm heading into my day. You guys are heading into your evening. So thanks again for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Levi.
It's a pleasure.
For more information about the Bible GPS, please visit our website at thebiblegps.com. Please subscribe to our channel, share the video, like it, and leave us a comment. You can also support our ministry by donating. All the information is in our website. Thank you and God bless.